Let me begin by addressing the differences between globalized vision of planning and building and a more regional vision. The globalized vision now is influencing almost all construction and design around the world and has displaced the localized input into construction and architecture. I believe this is a catastrophic mistake because the globalized forces are really pushing an agenda in a certain form language, a certain style, a certain palette of industrial materials. Most of these are inappropriate to local regions. In fact, they're inappropriate everywhere. And yet people adopt them for ideological, political reasons, or certain power groups adopt them and then force them on the population. For example, the global approach to building is to use the very severe geometric form language that goes back to Germany of the 1920s. Cubes, no color, glass and steel, concrete with rebars, and apply this regardless of the culture, climate, geographical location, function of the buildings intended. It's all the so-called international style totally ignores the variety of human needs and different climates, different cultures. So clearly, for someone who wishes to build something that is useful and adapted to local life and local culture, one needs to redevelop the variety of the original narrative of development. And except for very, very remote and isolated places, this has been totally wiped out almost all over the world. According to the type of architecture and design that my friends and I are proposing, based on the work of Christopher Alexander, it is essential to design from a regional base. For that, one has to fight the forces of conformity and engage in a more regional worldview. How do we do that? Well, opposing the vast amounts of money and political power behind the global international style of building is very, very difficult, precisely because it is backed by power and a lot of money. So this requires a political and regional organization where a sufficiently large local movement can propose building solutions and architectural solutions that are more adapted to the local variety of architecture with a sufficient money backing and political backing to oppose the inevitable global type of pressure to build just more concrete boxes and glass and steel high rises all over the world. So even before we begin to talk about architecture, one has to try to involve a local power structure that is interested in supporting local building and the local society, and but it's not just one or two people. It has to be large enough in order to be able to maintain building activity, which requires financing, funding, the momentum to get government permissions, etc., etc. So this is an organizational problem before we even begin to think of planning and architecture. I just mentioned that in order to construct a locally based regionalism, we need to have sufficiently a coherent organization that will be able to do that and to oppose the power of the globalized, faceless, monotonous construction. That's a very large problem. Unfortunately, there's also another totally independent problem that we face, and that is conformity of the people. People all over the world are exposed to the media, and the media's function is twofold. One, to inform people of events and news and things that they don't know about. And the second is propaganda. The media is really an instrument for propaganda that can be used and manipulated by those who have an agenda. And the forces of globalization have used the media as propaganda ever since the 1920s, really. And I'm talking definitely about architecture and urban design. The media are full of images of this promised utopia that is a lifeless world of concrete and highways and high-rises and glass and steel skyscrapers. In reality, for those who live this type of built environment, it is a totally inhuman environment. However, people who have a life in a developing country with all the problems of poverty falsely think that this is a promise for the future. And so they will very innocently accept these images as images of the future, something to be looked for, something that will make their way of life better, towards a better economy, a more advanced society, a better future for their children. This is a lie, and it is just a very successful product of the propaganda of the architectural globalism that promotes these empty images and lifeless cities and buildings. However, try to convince ordinary people, common people of this, and you will come up with tremendous arguments. Because the people have seen this in the movies, have seen these lifeless buildings, but they have seen them in the context of very glamorous stars and celebrities living in these lifeless and totally depressing environments. Rooms with glass walls and glass furniture and concrete boxes. It is extremely difficult to fight this propaganda because it is run and propagated by a $1 trillion media, global media empire, and it has been going on for almost a century now, many decades. So if you go to a village and you tell them, listen, your environment here is much more human than these images you see on the television or in the cinema, and they will say, no, we want to tear down our houses here and put up concrete blocks or glass and steel high-rises, because that's the future. And you have a hard time convincing them that such an action will destroy the humanity of their environment. Even though this has happened all over the world from Asia, South America, the Middle East, all over the world, this has happened with disastrous consequences for the people. The people have been convinced to replace their very human, although poor, living environments with inhuman, industrial, mechanical, globalized environments. And that for many societies that has been a death blow, because it has torn that society apart. It has removed the last vestiges of humanity, because the new environment is totally sterile and hostile. It does not it's not conducive to human life at all. So we come up to a extremely important question. In the face of this barrage of misinformation and groupthink that erases our cultural and architectural and urban traditions, how do we preserve what we have from our heritage and culture? How do we, more importantly, how do we reintroduce what we have lost in places where everything has been destroyed, and you have the contemporary globalized city that is rather unpleasant? Well, here's a solution. Pattern languages. Reintroduce pattern languages and start to use pattern languages for design and construction. A pattern language is a language, just like a spoken or written language, that consists of units, which are patterns. Each pattern is a design statement, which I will explain now. And we have many patterns, and they fit together very nicely with grammatical rules, just like in a language. So you don't have just a collection, an arbitrary collection of patterns. When you work with patterns, they fit very nicely together. So you make a sentence, and if you make a sentence the wrong way, then it doesn't make any sense. In the same way, when you use patterns, there is a syntax and a structure, a linguistic structure to the patterns. Now, what is a pattern? A pattern is a sociogeometric statement, a discovered solution. Sociogeometric, it is a bit of the social life of a community of people, and it has to do with the geometry. Certain types of geometries help a certain social function. For example, in a house, we want to have the circulation, and we need a circulation from the main living area. A main living area, say, is a pattern where the whole family can get together and sit together for those functions where the family needs to be together. And then a different pattern will connect the main living area with the other areas, which are more private, and go off to the bedrooms, into the kitchen, etc. So these are different patterns that we have, and you notice that I'm mixing social needs of the people, the functions of the individuals or groups of people, with certain geometry. Now, this is not a geometry that is rigid. It is more like connectivity. It is a geometry that when you draw it on a plan, it can take 1,000 different shapes. Yet all those 1,000 different shapes will have, if they have the same connectivity, then they will satisfy the pattern. Another pattern, say, is the availability of natural light in rooms. We feel much healthier when we have light on several sides of a room. We feel very depressed if we are in a very long room with light only on one side, one of the long sides, and then we see that it's rather depressing. The most depressing is a room with no lights at all. And we know very well that people who are forced to live or work in a room with no light at all, fine, they can put a lamp, but it's not the same. The human being, as an animal, craves natural light. So if at all possible, we need to have access to natural light. And this is another pattern. Each discipline has its own pattern language, no longer architectural. For example, biology is a very morphological sort of discipline, and there are rules for combining DNA, say, and then you go up to the structure of the organisms. The structure of organisms, you see recurrent types of geometries in organisms. There is no infinite variety of organisms. We have organisms of, say, spherical or tubular shape. These are recurring at various different scales. So you have a pattern language of biology. Very few people have taken the trouble to write out the pattern language of biology, but it is understood by biologists that they're talking about patterns all the time. And the important part of a pattern is that it is a solution, and once a solution is achieved, then you can reuse it, and it saves you from having to discover the solution. So an animal that has discovered a solution then encapsulates that solution in the DNA, so it doesn't have to recover it again, and passes that information on to its children or generations now. So all of biology is really a transmission of patterns that an ancestor discovered. The same thing goes on in computer science. Computer scientists discover a piece of code that works very nicely, and they formulate it as a pattern, and then they publish it and spread the pattern to their colleagues, so the colleagues save themselves, say, 1 year of work to discover the same pattern. They can just reuse that pattern. The same way, a pattern in architecture, as the common living room, say, has been discovered 10,000 years ago and has been passed on through generations. Having a pattern language handy can help us connect to our roots and our traditions. Because a pattern language consists of two parts, really. It's like a common language, universal language all over the world, because people are more or less the same around the world, so they feel comfortable applying the same patterns. So people in South America will apply the same patterns as people in northern Russia and people in the Fiji Islands. There is another number of patterns that are very local, and of course those are specific to that culture. But the majority of patterns are global. I will use this word again, because they're invariant. They conform to the human needs of the human body and society in general. So those patterns can be used anywhere in the world, and then you have specific patterns that apply to a society. Therefore, by using patterns, we can recover the human element, and when we are in that frame of mind, really, it puts a designer, an architect, into the frame of mind to appreciate those geometrical configurations that connect us with healthy conditions. And invariably, we find that our own traditions. And of course, we have thousands of different traditions all over the world. Each one of those traditions connects those people with a healthy environment. Why? Because for the last 10,000 years, people have been building their own dwellings and cities in order to be healthy, and they have done the best job they could. So the patterns have arisen there, and we can find the patterns, we can discover the patterns. It's only in the last 50 years or so that people branded themselves professional architects and imposed unhealthy living spaces on other people. And not on themselves, of course. The architects themselves live in very comfortable private buildings, but they impose these monstrosities and unhealthy environments on other people. Unfortunately, that has become the objective of the profession in the last several decades, but there is no need to put up with that indefinitely. We live in an age of global communication. This has its positive points and its negative points. The negative points are that the global power of indoctrination and propaganda pushes glass and steel skyscrapers to be built all over the world. I have discussed that a few minutes ago. But there are positive aspects because the communications are global. So someone who knows where to look for information will find that there's an incredible amount of information available now on the internet, freely available, and that includes what I'm talking about, includes patterns and the pattern way of thinking in design. So what was known only to a few people even 20 years ago is now freely available on the web, and you can locate this information, and most of it is free. If you need to buy the books, at least you locate what books you need to find, which is a tremendous advantage. And people talk about it and write papers, and most of those are freely available. So in the age of global information now, architects in even very isolated regions of the world can discover the power of patterns, and once they read about and grasp the central idea, then they can develop their own patterns from their own traditions, something that has not been done. So once the idea is there, then one can create a regional type of architecture. Furthermore, and this is very important, I have come across people who are geographically isolated, who have been thinking about these things, but have not been able to sell their ideas, to implement their ideas, because of very stiff opposition from a globalized power of concrete boxes and glass and steel high-rises. Now they discover that there are many people around the world who are using patterns and who are talking about patterns in design, and that creates a global community. So now we have the possibility of the global community. And how is that important? One, I mentioned the information, but more importantly, the camaraderie and the support, the moral support one has when one is working in some small town somewhere in Asia. The moral support one has, knowing that there are people all over the world who are doing essentially the same thing in their own community. So this is now a way of knowing that one is not isolated, and one has problems, and one can ask, say, a person, an architect in Pakistan can ask an architect in Mexico about a certain solution. And maybe those solutions, the patterns are going to be the same if the climate is the same. Why not? If the climate and the materials are the same, then those patterns are going to be the same. A pattern language is a part of life itself. The patterns were developed in order for people to live in a built environment. And as I mentioned earlier, every discipline has its own pattern language, even though we're not used to think of disciplines in terms of pattern language. For example, agriculture has its own pattern language, which is very simply the traditional practices of agriculture as they have evolved over millennia in a certain locale. This is very specific to that locality, to that region, and that's a pattern language. The people living there have their pattern language of habitation, and that has to blend in very nicely with the agriculture, because this is one way of life. It is indivisible. Where you live and where you work and what you do is an indivisible part of life. So the pattern language for that region blends in very nicely with what is done in that region. Now, in a very different manner, a city has a totally different way of life than the countryside, the agricultural countryside. So there are pattern languages for city life, and those pattern languages will connect to the pattern language for design of individual dwellings. Now, since people are going to be the same in the city and in the countryside, the interior of the houses will probably be the same, with some slight changes if they need to adjust to the actual agricultural lifestyle. So we have here the realization of an invariant set of patterns that apply everywhere, both in the city and in the countryside, and other patterns that vary because they have to connect to city life and patterns that describe city life, and other patterns in the countryside that have to connect to the agricultural practice. So we have here related but distinct types of patterns. In a pattern language, let's take the example of the entrance. The entrance to a house must be well marked so that people know that they're entering the house. This is so simple to say. However, look at traditional houses which have a modest, simple entrance. Many traditional houses ornament the entrance so that it stands out. You have a feeling of approaching. You can see the entrance from far away. You have a feeling of approaching. You go through the entrance. Even to extend the entrance, to have a space that is the entrance space, that is in an intermediate space between the outside of the house and the inside of the house. So you have, say, a tiny little ante room. It could be just modest dimensions. Look all over indigenous architecture and vernacular architecture, and you will see this wonderfully defined entrances. Now look at the architectural magazines with all the fashionable award-winning houses by prize architects. There is no entrance. You cannot see the door. And if you see the door, it's uninviting. It does not invite you to go into the house. It's a hostile. It's a hostile feeling. These are not houses fit for humans. Now, the pattern language is not enough to build and design. You need a totally different language, which is the form language. The form language has to do with the structure, has to do with the materials, has to do with the dimensions. The form language includes what material do I build? What material do I build to make a door frame, a window frame? How do I make the window? The ornamentation in a house, ornamentation. The need for ornamentation is a pattern, so that is universal. Every interior dwelling for human beings needs ornamentation. Now, the specific ornamentation is not a pattern, it is a form language. And that goes back, say, a few thousand years. What ornamental designs does this particular culture use in its textiles, in its artifacts, in its architecture? And you use that. And why do we use that? Because this it has been part of this culture. And by maintaining the tradition, you maintain the human feeling and the healing effect that ornament has. So you need to decide on the form language. So we need to decide on the form language, and of course here we get into technical details. If you are in a very traditional place, it may be advantageous to adopt some contemporary materials. But so now we want to adopt some contemporary materials only to help the form language, not to replace the form language. And we don't want to import materials that will raise the cost. So forget the glass and steel high rises that want to be imposed all over the place. If we can use steel beams, fine, but there's a delicate balance here. Do we want to pay all this money somewhere else in order to use these materials? So form language can certainly be modified if it's for the better, without upsetting the cost balance of this particular form language. At the same time, we don't want anything that will ruin the form language, like glass walls. Glass walls destroy a form language because they eliminate all the surface quality, and the surface quality includes the ornamentation, the color of the walls, the texture of the walls, all the gradation and the tactile part of the dwelling, which are so important for human health and human life. Glass wall totally eliminates that, and that was the objective, very anti-human industrial objective, which has caused so much damage. Let's say, what are the pattern languages and form languages for Kashmir, for example? Well, pattern language, one can use all the published patterns in Christopher Alexander's book, A Pattern Language. Once an architect understands the concept of the pattern language, then they can document local patterns that will aid that language, which are local and exist in the vernacular architecture of the region. So there you have the pattern language that we'll use for construction. On the other hand, the form language, we go and we see the traditional form language, the materials, as I just mentioned. Perhaps traditional materials are good for a certain purpose: heat insulation, protection against earthquakes. Can we introduce more contemporary materials that will help and not destroy, replacing certain ways of construction with reinforced concrete? That reinforced concrete may just collapse in an earthquake. So you don't want to do that. You want to be very careful about what you're going to do, and then you will have an updated form language to tie into the pattern language, and that will give you the tools for a future construction that will respect and preserve the vernacular life and the traditions of that regionalism in that region.